Well, thanks very much, Jason. Great intro. And thank you, Chemular and the TPE for inviting me here. It's great to be back. Like Mike Bonds talked about yesterday, there was a lot of you that were here yesterday, but a lot of you are going to forget most of what I said yesterday. 50%, I think, is what he said. It will be forgotten by now. So I am going to use some of the slides that I presented yesterday. I hope that's perhaps interesting to go through it again, but also there's quite a lot more new slides, particularly on retail. So look, we'll get into it. Just a quick background on me. So I'm the managing director of Tamarind. We publish 3 online platforms which provide data for the sectors that we're looking at. So e-cig intelligence, as the name suggests, is vape. Tobacco intelligence is heated tobacco and nicotine pouch, particularly, and we're starting to expand that into some other products as well. And can intelligence is cannabis. So what am I talking about today? So we're going to focus on novel products mainly. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the novel nicotine product market in general. So what is it looking like globally? And then we'll focus in on the US. I'm going to talk about disposables to start with, and particularly disposables in vape stores as a retail environment. And I think, like I always say, vape stores are a really good bellwether for what is going on in the market. They tend to take the new trends first, and stuff that happens in vape stores is worth looking at, just because even if you're not a vape store, it will give you an indication of what might come through on Main Street pretty quickly. So we'll talk about disposables, we'll talk about what's going on in the US, but we'll also talk a little bit about some of the trends happening elsewhere. And I think it's slightly reversing now, and we talked a bit about this yesterday. Trends that happened first here would then go to Europe. I think we're starting to see the reverse happening a bit now, and there's some things that are happening in Europe that I think are worth looking at, particularly around disposables. Okay, then we'll talk about nicotine pouch. Actually, I've got this wrong. We're talking about nicotine pouch. I was going to put some heated tobacco stuff in. I've taken it out. I'm going to talk about some cannabis stuff. So I'm going to talk about CBD, which is kind of in decline, but still there. I'm talking very much about Delta 8, which I think is a really interesting and growing area, and then a bit about kratom and some other things. I'm going to go for probably about half an hour. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions. If not, I'm around for the rest of the day, so do come and grab me. All right, so we had this slide up yesterday, and I really put this up almost just to put into context where we are with the novel nicotine product sector. And I think it's pretty exciting. I mean, we've been in business now for 10 years. And it amazes me that we've been around for 10 years, but I can tell you every single one of those 10 years, everything has changed, and we've started all over again, and there's a new trend. But what is exciting, I think, particularly about novel nicotine, is the size that it's already reached. And we hear a lot of negative things about the regulatory situation here in the US, but also regulatory restrictions that are happening everywhere around the world. But despite that, we're seeing massive growth. This is a sector now that we think is worth about $60 billion US dollars, more than 100 million users, and it's still growing. And in fact, particularly growing in some of the new categories like nicotine pouch. This slide here is a little bit, it's a little bit complicated and busy, but basically I think what we're trying to say is there's very different attributes to markets across the world. So here in the US, it's very much focused on vape. This was where vape first happened. Vape has been really successful here. It's slowed down a bit recently, but it's still the majority of the sector. So that box on the left-hand side there, the top chart is a value in terms of millions of US dollars. So, we're looking at just over, something like $12 billion, I think. And then the number of users underneath. So the US market is very much vape plus some nicotine pouch. That little grey bar on the top there is nicotine pouch. It's starting to grow. Nicotine pouch is a category which I'm sure we're going to see a lot of next door. There's a lot of activity going on in nicotine pouch. It's really interesting as a crossover product. In fact, a lot of vapors are using pouch. And we're seeing this sector grow. And it's not just in consumers who have already, used and had a history of oral tobacco use. We're seeing it very much come into consumers who, have never used an oral tobacco product. So it's a really interesting category. Going to the right-hand side, so Latin America, really still nothing happening. You can look at that in two ways. You know, in one way, you know, it's still not going well because the regulatory situation is really bad. On the other hand, there's masses of potential there. There's a huge number of smokers, and we think it will, it will start to take off. We're starting to see some regulatory changes. So Argentina has banned all these products for a long time, but they're looking like they might open up. So I think, you know, Latin America will be really interesting to look at over the next few years. It's not contributing much right now. Then, so Europe and Asia, I think, are similar kind of profiles in that we've got very, very large heated tobacco markets. And heated tobacco has been a surprise success, I think, in a lot of markets that are not kind of Asian markets. The product started in Japan and Korea. They were incredibly successful there. I think there was a lot of people that were perhaps, you know, cynical about whether or not it could do well in other markets, but it has. And you can see there the orange bar in Europe and the orange bar in Asia Pacific. So EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa, it's still a big vape market. The vape sector has really grown, but the value of the heated tobacco market is now larger, and we're starting to see nicotine pouch grow. And as I said yesterday, nicotine pouch is the fastest growing category in all three. Similarly, Asia Pacific, so Japan and Korea are still the powerhouses of heated tobacco, and the value there is really strong, but we're starting to see heated tobacco you know, make some progress in other markets. But vape is still big, and it's worth remembering that the vape market in Asia is still enormous. And frankly, in all of these markets, there's still masses of headroom. There's huge potential. We're talking about a market that's currently worth 60 billion. It compares to a combustible cigarette market of over 800 billion. So there's still really a long way to go. So I'm really proud of the sector in the sense that, you know, in 10 years we've got to this, you know, when we started it was worth kind of zero. It's worth 60 billion. But I think over the next 10 years we might well see this accelerate. And for me, I think that's a really optimistic story. So when you get bogged down in PMT applications and all of that sort of stuff, remember that this, you know, this sector is really lively and really growing. All right, some stuff on vape stores. So we do a vape store survey here in the US every year. If you're in this room and you're a US vape store and you've not taken part, I'd really encourage you to. The benefits for you are that we consolidate a lot of the data. It's all completely anonymous, but we consolidate it and we give it back to you. So you'll get a lot of some of these slides I'll show you, but you get a big pack back as a contributor to the vape store survey. But also I think it's really important, and some of the things I'm going to talk about today really demonstrate how you know, retail in vape stores, I think, is a you know, is a really good retail environment. There's lots of protections in terms of age protections, and some of the things that concern regulators around the world, I think we can show that vape stores are doing a good job on that. So what's going on in vape stores? Well, I mean, as you can see, the sort of mix of products that is going through the vape store segment has changed dramatically. So you look back to 2018, it was all open systems. The majority, you know, the standard rule was 2/3 of the revenue of a vape store was through selling liquids. Fast forward to last year, we're looking at 1/3 of the revenue now coming from the disposable sector. So, you know, really quite a lot. And again, we'll go into this in a bit more detail, but that 14% of the top of other products, vape stores are having to start to move into other products. We're seeing a lot of cannabis products and other things come through. So the mix is really changed, and the retail environment for vape stores has really changed here in the US. It's no different in other countries in the world. We do similar surveys elsewhere, and it's very much a similar kind of picture. Consumers really want disposables, and we'll come on to why. So what's going on with disposables? I put this in just a comparison between the UK and the US in terms of age group, which is one of the big concerns around disposables at the moment. I'm coming, you know, here, you can tell from my accent, I'm from the UK, and of course on Monday, there was a huge amount of controversy because the government announced a disposable ban in the UK. Now, not entirely unexpected. I think we expected it to happen at some point, and In any event, I think a lot of the environmental legislation that is going on in the UK and in Europe would mean that disposables would need to be banned by default. But I think it's still a shock that the government's moved quite fast. We're fairly sure that this government will implement a disposable ban, and I think if we're likely to have a new government by the end of the year. I think that new government will continue the same policy. So disposables in themselves are limited, and as I'll go on to say, I think we're seeing that happen already in Europe. But look, as I said, one of the major problems around disposables has always been age group, and I think this chart kind of shows it. US and the UK have similar patterns, and we're seeing the same thing happen in many countries. So these are much more likely to be used by younger age groups. Not huge differences in between the sexes, male and female, but this preponderance of a younger generation is what's causing a lot of the policy problems around the world for disposables. But why are people buying them then? Well, the reason is very simple. I mean, these products work really well, and convenience is a big driver of why people buy them, so that's the ease of use there. Again, very similar profile of reasons why people buy disposables. One thing I've just circled, that low price thing. One of the key differences between the US market and European markets in general, but particularly the UK, is that disposables in Europe are limited in terms of tank size, as many of you know. That limit means that the prices of the products in the UK stay pretty low, and of course in the US, and I'll show this in another slide, but we're seeing tank sizes dramatically increase for disposables. So we're seeing disposables of enormous sizes, 36 millilitres and so on. And of course, the price point for those products is a lot higher. So anyway, so ease of use, low price, curiosity, good flavor delivery. I mean, these products work. That's why they're popular. That's why they're selling well. Any drawbacks? Well, in Europe, we've got some issues around environmental concerns. That's another driver of these bans that are coming through in Europe. Less so, I think, in the US, as you can see there. But there are some concerns around pricing. They are more costly to operate on a long-term basis. So for long-term vapors, these are products that are actually going to cost more generally. And you can see there, I just put in some segmentation there just out of interest. So male, female, very consistent really. And we've got pretty consistent between age groups as well. So, the summary of all of this really is disposables are a great product category. They've done an awful lot by the way of positive. There's an awful lot of smokers that have started to use vape because of disposables. And I think, it's really important to point that out. I mean, in amongst this whole discussion around underage usage is the very fact that these products are doing really well at converting combustible smokers into vapors. All right, so back into vape stores. So as a result of doing these vape store surveys, we get a pretty good idea of what brands are being carried in disposables. I thought it would just be interesting to show this. I think there are two main things to take away from this chart. And again, if you want these slides, well, come to me, or Jason said that you can download them. But one of the key things, I mean, firstly, the brands that are going through these vape stores are changing all the time. So there is a massive difference in the brands that are doing well from year to year. The second thing is obviously there's one brand here that is doing extremely well, Elf Bar, and it was quite interesting to see the development of Elf Bar and some other brands and how well they did early on. They got the distribution right. They had very good products. The development of this brand is a very interesting story in how you can be successful with these products. So it's not a stable sector, but we're starting to see some consolidation, and I think we're really starting to see that certain brands are kind of leading the pack. So we've got the top whatever brands there are, so Elf Bar is kind of 40% in total if you count in Lost Mary and the others, and we've got around 70% of the brands held. 70% of reported revenue from vape stores are coming from 10 brands, which is quite consolidated. Okay, here's some things which I think would be really good to pass on to regulators. Again, this is another thing that is a benefit, I think, of taking part in these vape store surveys that we do, is we get good data which really shows good things about the retail environment and what vape stores are doing. Here is what vape stores say they're doing in terms of age restrictions, so checking age. And as you can see, I think the story is really good. Basically, 100% of stores do some kind of check. We're seeing the different types of checks there, so manual IDs and some kind of signage and youth prevention tracking. So we're getting quite a lot of good feedback. A third of respondents have all three of those, so there's not just one, but a number of different checks in place. And then just anecdotally, you can see kind of some of the provisions that store owners are putting in place. Employees will be terminated immediately if they sell to underage. Refuse to sell to adults we know are supplying underage. That was another massive problem. I had a conversation with someone yesterday about that. You've got people who are of age coming in buying for underage kids, and that's a big problem as well. And look, multiple ID checks. So I think this is a really good story to point out to regulators. The vape store segment is a good segment to sell. The big problem actually is probably outside the vape store segment. Another thing, I think vape stores, and I'd be really interested to do a similar bit of work on some of the other retail environments, convenience stores and so on, but I think what's clear from this story as well is that we're getting a lot of enforcement on the vape stores. So within the last year, nearly half of vape stores have been visited with some kind of enforcement. And you can see the splits there between state, federal, FDA visits and the sort of more local visits. What is also quite interesting is just what kind of enforcement activities are taking place. Well, age check is obviously a big one, and state authorities and local authorities are really focused on that a lot more. When you look at more kind of product and manufacturing checks, they tend to be more likely to be carried out by federal authorities. But then you can see quite a lot of different checks. So clearly there's quite a lot of mystery shopping going on. There's a lot of checks that are happening. And I think the story here is vape stores are perhaps getting targeted a little bit more than some of the convenience stores that are not being perhaps so diligent about this kind of stuff. All right, let's go back to disposables in general. So I talked a little bit about why they're popular from a consumer perspective, so why are people using them, ease of use and so on. What's actually happening in the sector is that we're seeing a huge growth in the number of disposable products available in the market in the US, but also elsewhere. So this chart is, we carry out a quarterly tracking of products. We've got the bars representing the number of products in our check. So that's not necessarily all of them, but you can see this massive growth since kind of 2021 in the US, that grey bar. It's matched similarly in Canada and the UK, but to a lesser degree, I guess. And then the lines that are coming down are the price per milliliter. And of course, that's another thing that's happening in the market, and particularly in the US. As the products get bigger, the price per milliliter is dropping quite significantly. It's happening in all markets, but I think it's most prominent in the US. And as the price goes down, the consumer proposition goes up. So fairly obvious there. Flavors, this is talked about a lot. We're facing all sorts of flavor restrictions all around the world for these products. I think it's important to point out kind of where we are with flavors. Everyone's worried about, what the flavor profiles are. Here you can see that big blue bar that's growing kind of quarter by quarter is the fruit category. So that's very much the majority category for a lot of these products. We're seeing quite a lot of combinations of different flavors. And then the other sort of major point, which I put into the title, is very few of these products are tobacco flavored. So they are, flavors are really important to consumers. They want flavors that are not reminding them of the smoking that they used to do in general. So again, quite interesting to see that written down kind of quantitatively. Another thing I think that's a big problem for regulators, and we've done quite a lot of work on this, is really enforcement. So we talked a lot yesterday about the difficulties with PMTA and the problems with the process that you need to go through to get a product approved. The reality in the US and most other markets is that it doesn't really matter at the moment because there's no enforcement carrying on, right? So the products that you're getting offered in retail environments, they haven't gone through a regulatory process, and there's no signs of that happening, frankly. The FDA is stepping up some of its enforcement activity. We've seen more and more of this happening, and I think it will keep increasing. But the reality is the market's not being regulated at all. The same is happening, by the way, in the UK and all across Europe. We're seeing a lot of products come in, and the reason is that a lot of these products are being distributed directly to retailer or directly to consumer, and that's been the great success. I mean, that's great. The great success of some of these brands is that they can directly distribute these products to retailers, and that's been an excellent way to get the products out and be successful. But I think what's quite interesting is just what are the authorities doing about this? And what we did here is we tracked the reports from the Chinese authorities. Most of these products, obviously, as we know, manufactured in Shenzhen in China. We tracked where the products were going, and so that you can track the value of products that are leaving China going for certain destinations, and you compare with what the customs authorities are reporting as being imported into the country. So the grey bar is what's being reported as being exported. So on the first chart on the left is the US compared to the UK on the right. There is a massive trade discrepancy between what China is saying is being exported to the US and what the US authorities are tracking as coming in. That dark blue bar is what's coming in, and frankly, it's laughable how how big that gap is. Now, the same was happening in the UK, and to be honest, the same is happening in a lot of countries, but there is some kind of cause for hope because, as you can see, there was some changes in the UK. This data is from 2022, by the way, so it's a bit old. But there is some hope because there was a big change in the UK around customs declaration. There was a process change that happened in the UK, and you can see the results. Suddenly, the UK was starting to track products coming in. So there is a way to enforce this, and I think the story will be the same eventually in the US as well. I think we're going to see some changes come through. All right, and then I just wanted to pass this on. This was, what I was referring to earlier, some trends that are happening in Europe that I think will come over here into the US. So in the US, we're still seeing this massive growth in disposables. In Europe, we're seeing that velocity slow down. So we're seeing a slowdown in the number of disposable products, and even a drop in places like France. We're seeing fewer products coming through. Meanwhile, those blue bars, as you can see, we're seeing a lot more pre-filled pods come into the market. There is a problem here in the US, a regulatory problem, which is that flavoured pods are still restricted here. So I'm not sure that same pattern is going to happen. But what's very interesting is I think we're seeing this slowdown in disposables because it's a preemption of the restrictions we're about to see. And so on, and so the bans that we're starting to see in European markets. I put a chart up yesterday about how many countries in Europe are considering a disposables ban, and it's a majority. So we are definitely going to see restrictions. We're definitely going to see this sector change. It's going to move from a disposables market into rechargeable, refillable, and potentially open system market. So I think this trend is something to look out for, and it's worth thinking about for the US. Eventually, it'll happen here, I think. Okay, we'll change gears slightly now. So I'm going to talk about nicotine pouches. And as I said, I think this is a really exciting category. It's growing really fast. It's the fastest growing category of all the three nicotine products that we track. It started off, as this map, I suppose, suggests, it started off as a trend in Scandinavia, so the Nordic countries where they have a very big tradition of snus is where nicotine pouches started. I think a bit like, lots of these sectors, I think, to start with, we assumed that this was going to be a product that was really only going to be used by snus users and potentially chew users here in the US. But actually what we're starting to see is all sorts of countries with no tradition of oral tobacco, as I said, starting to use these products. So we're starting to see some Eastern European countries really start to take off. UK is really strong, and obviously the US as well. And then we've got some other markets where, we're tracking, but there are more regulatory restrictions. So Canada and Russia, Both, nascent nicotine pouch markets now heavily restricted, but we'll see. We'll see how those markets go. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. Nicotine pouch, I think, is a category that reminds me a lot of 10 years ago, the early days of vape. It's very fragmented. There are lots of different brands. There's lots of unofficial retail, frankly. There's lots of online retail. And there are lots of problems with the product category from a regulatory perspective as well. So that, the regulatory environment is far from being sorted out. It's even worse than vape, if that's possible to understand. Look, we track this quite thoroughly in terms of flavors per country. The US is very consistent in terms of its flavors splits compared to some of the other markets that we track in Europe. Nicotine strengths we talked a little bit about yesterday. So nicotine strengths tend to develop over time. So as markets start off, they tend to be quite a light market, and you'll see the US there is to the far right. It's much more a light nicotine pouch market, but we expect it to move into a heavier, stronger nicotine category eventually. So these things change over time. And then, of course, just in terms of the different brands, I did mention this, but there are some obvious standout brands here in the US. We've had this whole Zyn thing in the press recently. And Zyn is doing incredibly well here, but there's a big long tail of products that are doing well in the US, and this is changing all the time. So the sort of relative strengths of the popularity of these products is constantly on the change, as it is in other markets around the world. All right, I'm just going to, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through some stuff on cannabis now. Jason mentioned that I was kind of going to try and tackle every single product that's out there. I don't think I can do that. But what I wanted to say, we do track cannabis. Cannabis is in a bit of a slump, I think it's fair to say. The sector, in many cases, I think the sector overpromised and underdelivered, and that's the same in the US as it is, and potentially even worse in other markets around the world. So we were very focused on European cannabis and the whole idea that cannabis was going to open up in Europe similarly to the way it has done here in the US. That's not happening. It's much, much slower, and I think even in the US, it's been much harder to roll out than people expected. But what I wanted to talk about today was, a bit about CBD, but also very much about Delta-8. So hemp-derived cannabis products are now massively prevalent. They're growing in a lot of markets, particularly in states where there's no recreational cannabis market at the moment. Where are we with the current status of the regulation? Well, this might remind you a bit of the situation with nicotine. I mean, there are really grey areas around hemp-derived cannabis products. So it's not currently under the Farm Bill a controlled substance, and that means that it gets exceptions around and exemptions around some of the regulatory environments here in the US. But there are major problems still with hemp-derived products. So they're not approved as dietary supplements or food ingredients. There is an approved CBD product. Frankly, it's exactly the same as a lot of the CBD that's on the market, in the kind of commercial market. But it's been approved as a medicine here in the US, and if you're trying to sell something that is already approved as a medicine, you have major problems. So there are a number of regulatory problems with cannabis. In reality, and as we will probably see next door, there's an awful lot of hemp-derived products on the market, and the FDA is not doing an awful lot about it. So they are sending a few warning letters. They're particularly sending warning letters to companies, more of them actually in the last few years. But companies that were claiming health benefits from CBD, they were clamping down on that pretty fast, right? But if you're not saying anything about the product, in reality, these products are being sold. What are we going to see in the future? Well, I think it's highly unlikely that Congress is going to move very fast on this. From what our US lawyers tell me, I mean, the Farm Bill is a massive piece of legislation. It's really not going to be of high importance what is written about hemp in that Farm Bill. We haven't even seen a draft of it yet. It was promised last year. We're unlikely, I think, to see it this year in an election year here in the US. And I think what our lawyers are saying is, look, we're very we're very unlikely to see major changes in it. So there may be some risk that that extracts of hemp are kind of restricted. There may be some changes to THC levels and stuff like that, but I suspect kind of no change. What does it mean for cannabis in vape stores? Well, like I said, there was, and if you remember, I think there was a sort of 15% of reported revenue in vape stores is now coming from other products. The predominant products that revenue is derived from is cannabis. So it's both CBD and Delta-8 products. This chart is again from our vape store survey. You can see that, and again, this was 21 and 22. So the red is 21, the green is 22. So there was a big increase in terms of the number of stores that were carrying the products. More CBD than Delta-8, but Delta-8 is growing quite a lot. I think what's also interesting that they're carrying a lot of other stuff, so glassware, accessories, and so on. A bit of kratom at the end there. But what was very striking for me was this increase in the amount of revenue reported from Delta-8. So the revenue from CBD is still quite low, less than 10%. Revenue from Delta-8 going up to 20% now for those that carry it. So, clearly a lot of vape stores are moving into this category and making money from it. Bit now on the regulatory thing. So where are these hemp-derived Delta-8 products and others? Where are they allowed to be sold? Well, there's a bit of a patchwork across states, as you can see. So red are where it's banned. Green is where it's likely still legal. Although I would just hesitate and don't take my word for it. That may well change. But at the moment, the green states are where it's legal, and then we've got quite a lot of uncertainty. The general pattern, I think, as I said, is that these products are allowed in states that don't have recreational cannabis at the moment, and they are often banned in states that already have recreational cannabis. It's obvious, isn't it? But and the market is the same. So these products are sold a lot more in states where there is no recreational cannabis. I'm going to go through this pretty fast. So that there are starting to be some THC caps on hemp products in general. So we're starting to see this come through. There's just more and more regulation, I think, of Delta-8 products. More and more consciousness that these are selling well. And as products start to be more successful, you can be sure that regulatory authorities will look at it more. I think, as I said, there's still questions around the legality of these products, but meanwhile, we're seeing a lot of them sold. What do we think in terms of market size? Well, here we've attempted, it's very, very difficult. Some of this data is really difficult to get hold of, but we've attempted to estimate where the size of the market is and where it's going. We think it's about 3 billion, just less than 3 billion for last year, and it's growing quite fast, as you can see. Two scenarios there. The dark green is where we think the status quo will just continue, so states won't open up in terms of recreational, and the green is where more states move into recreational cannabis. Product splits, and for those of you retailing these, you will know already, but I mean it's mainly gummies, vape products, and flour, and so within those three, we're looking at kind of 80% of the product sold. So I hope that's clear. Last slide. I just mentioned these two products. I think we might see them a bit next door as well. So THCA flour is another great big thing that's happening. THCA, I won't get into the technicalities, but it's a kind of precursor for THC. So it's not specifically banned. It's kind of a regulatory exemption at the moment, but I would say that's probably going to be closed. There are lots of kind of issues around THCA, but we're seeing a lot of it appear. And then kratom, as I said, kratom is starting to be sold a lot by vape stores. Again, slightly regulatory grey area. We've got no kind of federal position on kratom, but we've got some bans in some states and some regulations in some states as well. So this is a really moving landscape of products. It's going to continue to change. We're seeing a lot of innovation. I came past a great big poster for psychedelic mushroom gummies. I mean, the sector never fails to surprise, does it? But I hope that's given you a bit of a sort of summary of some of the interesting products that are out there, and that's it. I don't know Jason, have I got time for questions, or do we need to move on? Yeah, some questions? Are there any questions? quite a... Oh, there is. Hi.
Given closings of retail shops, but there was roughly 9,000 in the US. So your sample that you have and you're deriving your data and analysis from is really small compared to the number of shops that are in the US. And so were you doing a random sampling of those shops or in stores, or how were you getting the data and then able to generalize that this is really what's going on?
Yes. So sample size is small, but I would say as a percentage of total, it's pretty good. I mean, it's quite interesting that you say it's a small number. The reality is, if you look at, all the incredibly successful companies that are tracking mainstream retail, I mean, they're taking a much smaller percentage of total retail to scale up. We frankly take any stores we can. So we generally get stores that represent about 500 stores in the sector. So 500 out of 9,000, not bad, I think. Some of those are obviously chains, and so we're kind of reflecting that in terms of our data. But look, can we cut that data down state by state? No, there's not enough. You're right. There's not enough respondents to be able to do that. But nevertheless, I think it's worth doing because, as I said, it's a really good bellwether for changes that are going to happen. So you start to see things that happen in vape stores, flavor progressions, for example, is often really a good thing to see. And even from a small sample, 100, 200 or whatever, you can get really good insights into what's happening in the sector. Yeah. So I'm not being defensive. I mean, I think you're right. There aren't enough. We don't have enough, and that's why I really encourage any vape stores out there to take part. But I mean, I think it's still an exercise that's worth doing.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Time for one more question. You want to make me?
Yeah. Well, we probably haven't been very good at. We worked a bit with some of the associations, so SFATA and various other associations. They were sending out, lots of requests for people to take part. But look, I would love to take your details, and I'll get in touch directly. We'll get a bit better, I think, at doing this. I feel a bit strongly about the vape store sector because it's kind of where we came from. We worked right from the start with vape stores. I think they've gone through a really hard time here and elsewhere in the world. I'm really keen. As I said, I think this is a really good retail environment for selling these products. I think the way that retail, vape stores can explain to customers how to use the products and to manage things like age control, I think is kind of much better than other retail, and I think it's something to really point out to regulators. So yeah, I'd love to take your details afterwards. That would be great.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks a lot, guys.